going to get into the meat of the discussion now. It is my distinct pleasure and honor in inviting to the stage the panelists, the speakers of this next session. Please welcome to the stage Ambassador Carlo Marsili, the former Italian ambassador to Türkiye. Thank you very much, sir. Welcome. Actually, take a seat right next to me. I'd now like to invite to the stage Professor Murat Yeşiltaş, a professor of social studies at the University of Ankara. Hoş geldiniz. Welcome. Sir Peter John Westmacott is the former British ambassador to Turkey, France, and the United States. Ambassador Westmacott, can we have you up here? Thank you. Pleasure, sir. Thank you very much. And rounding off this wonderful group is Peter Millett, director of the Peter Millett Consultancy. But I will actually add a title there in my first question, but the former ambassador to Libya, in Jordan, and the High Commissioner for Cyprus. Okay. Just a kind reminder to our panelists, I do have a headset, but you'll be speaking into your microphones. So if you could actually maybe just lean in so everybody can hear you, not only here in the auditorium, but also people that are watching us live. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it is fair to say that what we heard from the Turkish Vice President just a moment ago, Türkiye is charting its own course when it comes to strategic autonomy. When you look at it, in the last 2 decades, the country has gone through a quantum leap of sorts, going from a country that had to import most of its defense needs, its defense models, to now being the manufacturer and exporter of some very popular defense systems like the BAYRAKTAR drones. We heard about the KAAN fighter jets, not to mention advanced naval and missile platforms as well. Without further ado, I want to get into the discussion. Today we're going to sort of explore what this transformation means, not only for Türkiye, but also for Europe, NATO, and the wider defense ecosystem. Murat Yeşiltaş, I'd like to begin with you as you are the only Turk here on this panel. Talk to me about Turkey's pursuit of its strategic autonomy, and do you feel that it has, this pursuit has redefined its national security doctrine?
Thank you, Alican. It's a great honor to be here, and it's interesting. In the first time, we have been discussing the concept of strategic autonomy, and we have been trying to apply the Turkish foreign policy and defense policy, maybe over the last decades. But interestingly, it's the first time that an official, our vice president, has clearly mentioned that Turkish policy with reference to strategic autonomy. I think this is a great point that I would like to highlight, first of all. Because many commentators or experts and scholars have been trying to understand Turkey's rise in defense industry in terms of its impact on regional and global politics with reference to the strategic autonomy. I'm not sure whether this concept is really, fits what Turkey is trying to do, simply because there are, different countries in the international politics which are trying to gain their strategic autonomy. So it is therefore there are sort of strategic autonomies at clashes. So when we look at the European context, for example, which is the strategic autonomy is one of the main pillars of European defense and security architecture, and it was actually invented and announced in 1993. Mm-hmm. This is not new. The European Union have been trying to improve and calibrate their strategic autonomy, especially in the defense industry. But of course, after the war in Ukraine, now there is a huge debate across Europe that how Europe can calibrate their strategic autonomy vis-a-vis the conventional threat, vis-a-vis the Russian threat. But Turkish case, I think, is different compared to the European Union because, I mean, when it comes to the European Union is an organization, is an institutional body, which means that there are a lot of countries in which they have different priorities in terms of their defense industry. And they have also, of course, different security priorities. You know, when we look at the post-Ukraine war European strategic landscape, there are at least 3 different groups of countries which have different security orientations and defense prioritization vis-a-vis the threat of Russia. So therefore it will be very difficult, even though there is a really strategic program which have been announced in Europe, like SAFE program or Rearm Europe program. So therefore there are different understanding in Europe. But in Turkey there is an institutionalization of strategic autonomy. As Vice President has rightly mentioned, different sectors. It's not about the strategic autonomy for Turkey to improve its own capacity in defense industry. You know, the economy can be also defined within the context of strategic autonomy. What we understand with the term of strategic autonomy, for me, especially in defense and security domains, it's an ability to act independently and unilaterally if it is necessary. It doesn't mean that it is sort of a policy that Turkey is only trying to follow its own strategic priorities, because it has also the multilateral dimension. The point that I would like to highlight in this context is this policy is a reaction. First and foremost, it's a reaction against the global international change. As our President in the opening ceremony has rightly mentioned, that there is a growing uncertainty in international relations, and the previous speakers like the Director of General TRT has mentioned, Director of Communications, Professor Duran, has also mentioned that we are going towards uncertainty. So the main drivers behind the uncertainty is a great power competition. It has a certain technological aspect. So we are not, we don't know whether we are living under the condition of peace, which is not the case, or we are living under the condition of war, or we are living under the condition of unpeace. I think so. This is a really important point to discuss, especially to understand Turkey's position. So Turkey's strategic autonomy, I think, has different dimensions. As a summary, it has a technological dimension, first of all, and over the last 2 decades, Turkey has significantly improved its defense industry, and it's not in the position that Turkey has now an absolute strategic autonomy, because it is not possible to reach an absolute strategic autonomy. You have to work with other countries. Now Turkey is trying to be integral part of the European SAFE program or Rearm Europe program. So therefore you have to work with other countries. Turkey, I think, is following this path. As we have seen in the context of the agreement between Turkish private companies and the Italian private companies like Leonardo, it's, I think, the striking example to see how Turkey is trying to become a functional partner of the European Union. So secondly, beyond this technological posture of Turkey, there is, of course, the political dimension in it. When it comes to the cooperation between Turkey and the European countries, as we are witnessing nowadays, there is a political debate in Europe. Some of the countries are, against Turkey's integration into the SAFE program, or the newly emerging European defense and security architecture. So therefore, it is also the political issue that Turkey needs to, of course, recalibrate its strategic autonomy through the different political axes. This is the reason why Turkey has signed a huge agreement, a strategically important agreement with the UK on European Eurofighter. And this is the reason why Turkey is closely working with Spain, Portugal, and other strategic countries which have industrial capacity. So, of course, as a final point, Turkey's quest of strategic autonomy, I think, is a multifactorial booster in its international posture. Okay. It's helping, it enables its counterterrorism policies, it enables its foreign policy in different regional contexts, it enables its economic outreach, especially in the defense market, globally. It also enables its, the new way of understanding of defense industry within the context of domestic political discussion. It enables also the parties, the government, to recalibrate its own position within the wider political landscape in Turkey.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, but thank you very much for that explanation. I think it was good and necessary in terms of setting the stage. Since you mentioned the Eurofighter Typhoon project, I want to turn to your left, to our British guests. Ambassador Osmekat, let me begin with you. Professor Yeşiltaş was saying, okay, Turkey's approach is a little different, and it can be, primarily because of Russia's war in Ukraine. It can be different. It's a reaction to the global order. I want to begin by asking you your interpretation of Turkey's pursuit of strategic economy, and do you feel that this is a reflection of the evolving role that the country has when it comes to the global defense and security sector?
Thank you, Alican, for the opportunity to be with you and for your nice, easy question. We've heard from both the President and the Vice President today that Turkey would like to see a kind of revision of the global rules-based international order that was put together by the winners after the Second World War. And there clearly is a case for United Nations Security Council reform, as the President was making out. That's, I think, a medium-term objective. Right now, I think we have to be aware of the fact that the world is in a very unpredictable and rather dangerous situation. I think back to the classical historian Thucydides, who is well known for having warned of the risk of one rising power coming to war with an established hegemon, and how do you avoid a conflict. But he also warned us that at the time of the Peloponnesian Wars, not very far away from where we are today, that the reality was that the strong took what they wanted and the weak suffered as they had to. And we are at a stage where, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Vladimir Putin, whether it is Xi Jinping, you have got strong men with very autocratic positions, increasingly so even in the United States, who take a view that the big guys do more or less what they want. I mean, it's sort of extraordinary to have the United States saying, well, we'll have Canada, please, and we'll have Greenland, and we'll have Panama. This is kind of going back a couple of thousand years. Some of it's rhetoric, some of it is not serious, but it is a different situation. And as part of that, going back to some extent to the days of the Monroe Doctrine, those of us in Europe who are perhaps more vulnerable because we're a collection of smaller countries have got to look more seriously at our own defense responsibilities. We can less rely on others to save us if things get difficult. We've got an aggressive Vladimir Putin, not very far away from here, just across the Black Sea, who's helping himself to a chunk of Ukraine and has done other things in Bessarabia and in Georgia, and who knows, might wish to go further to try to recreate the old Russian Empire. And we've got the Western European pillar of NATO, which cannot rely as much as it has in the past on the United States, and which has been rightly criticized by America, not just this president, but also by President Obama, for not having shouldered enough of the burden and the cost of European defense. We had a wake-up call when I was ambassador in Washington from the defense minister, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, President Obama. They were all saying, come on, you guys, you've got to do a bit better. And we've had that in spades, as we say, from President Trump. So we Europeans, the European side of the NATO alliance, have to do more. And this brings us to the extraordinarily important contribution that Turkey makes. Turkey has, for many years, been the second largest standing army in the alliance. Turkey has done an extraordinary job in localizing its defense industrial capability from 20% to 80%, we heard from the Vice President, which I didn't know, but of course we see the extraordinary effectiveness of the aerospace industry, the space industry, the drone industry. You know, there's a whole lot of different elements of the Turkish defense capability which are becoming more and more important, and developing partnerships with close allies and friends, including my own country. And the deal that the British Prime Minister concluded with President Erdogan on Monday is an indication of how those of us on this side of the Atlantic have, in my opinion, no choice but to develop a shared defense capability and be less reliant on some of the big powers which may or may not wish to provide us with the equipment that we want, and may or may not wish to control the use that we make of them. After all, the cruise missiles which we have supplied in the United Kingdom to Ukraine to fight back against Russia are subject to certain American controls because there are American components in those missiles. And this is applicable across the board in the defense sector. So it is absolutely necessary for us Europeans, us smaller countries, if you like, to get our act together, to become more self-reliant, less dependent on others. And by the way, in the process of developing this strategic and defense industrial autonomy through partnerships, I quite agree, none of us can do this on our own, it is an instrument of generating the economic growth and prosperity that we so desperately need. Turkey is doing a bit better in terms of growth, if not in terms of inflation in the economy, than the rest of us. But some of us have very low productivity, very low growth, and a declining rather than an increasing defense industrial capability. We must do something about that. We owe it to ourselves to become more self-reliant, but collectively self-reliant. The UK made a mistake, in my opinion, in leaving the European Union and the single market, but it doesn't mean that we can't continue to cooperate and maybe do so even more effectively with our partners from Italy and from Spain and from Germany and France, and to help develop a stronger European capability with our partners here in Turkey. So I think the strategic autonomy means, in my view, that working more effectively with partners, less reliant on the big powers, and more aware of the risks to us all from the possibility of big, strong men who are the leaders, the unquestioned leaders, and to some extent the less democratic leaders than they were, of big powers who think that they might want to carve up the world between them and not pay sufficient attention to our interests. Okay. That is a very important strategic challenge to us all, and I'm delighted that we're all beginning now to work more effectively together to address those challenges.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ambassador Westmacott. I want to turn to your left, Ambassador Peter Millet. Ambassador Westmacott said, we need to do more. You and I were chatting shortly before we began this session, and you made a very pointed point in saying that Turkey is doing more. You have extensive experience in the region, in North Africa, in the Middle East. If I were to ask you to maybe reflect on what you feel Turkey is doing right in its pursuit for strategic autonomy, and maybe compare it to what some other countries, especially in the West, could be doing more.
Thank you for that question. I've seen over the last 10 years, I think, a significant development of Turkey's engagement, and I'll use Libya as the example because that's the one I saw at first hand. So in 2015, having been a civil war, Turkey and we at the UK and many other countries were involved in trying to put together a political solution, which was signed at the end of 2015. But then in 2019 and 20, when there was conflict in Tripoli, supported by the Russians, Turkey was the only country that responded to the appeal from the then government of national accord and intervened militarily. I think that was one of the first occasions when the BAYRAKTAR drones were used effectively against Russian-supplied anti-aircraft equipment. And it brought the stability and it brought a ceasefire about. That was the defense component, but what I've seen since then is Turkey developing that defense engagement and securing political advantage. There was the Memorandum of Understanding over the maritime borders. and then securing commercial advantage and significant commercial advantage and economic benefit for Turkey, not only in the west, but also in the east of Libya, against the very people that Turkey had been fighting against a couple of years earlier. And I think Turkish companies are very good at taking risks, but I detected a strategic approach from Ankara as a whole to connect the technology, the defense component, the political component, and the economic and commercial component, bring that together into bringing benefits for Turkey as a whole. And I think there's certainly scope there for the UK to learn some lessons and to work together with Turkey, not only in Libya, but I think the extension of that into the ceasefire in Gaza, the engagement of Turkey in Syria. I think there is an example which has been deployed in Libya very effectively, which I'm now seeing Turkey deploying in Syria, but also in other parts of the Middle East. And I hope that the British government will be working very closely with your officials in Ankara to achieve that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Millet. Ambassador Marsidi, I do apologize. Thank you for your patience. You have a lot of experience when it comes to observing and witnessing the evolution when it comes to Turkey's foreign and defense policies. If I were to ask you your take on the country's pursuit of strategic autonomy, maybe some opening remarks from you?
Yes, but global and regional powers are reshaping security strategies by adapting to a new defense paradigm focused on greater strategic autonomy. This is true for several countries. This is true for USA. This is true for China, pursuing a strategy of comprehensive national security, projecting itself as a global security player. This is true for Russia as well, challenging the existing order by escalating aggressive tactics to counter perceived Western confrontation. And for European Union as well, initiating a geopolitical awakening to act more independently because of the uncertainties about President Trump policy and the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, increasing defense spending and building new security initiatives like PESCO, etc. Even Japan, with the new Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi, who wants to raise defense spending to 2% of GDP. So as a matter of fact, in this framework, Turkey is also positioning itself in global defense. Its evolving defense industry, its assertive foreign policy, its technological ambitions reflect that effort. Turkey represents, in my view, a model of how middle powers can combine diplomacy, defense industrialization, and regional influence to assert more independent security postures. Turkey is repositioning itself by balancing its NATO commitments with a more independent foreign policy which prioritizes national interests. This involves contributing significantly to our collective defense, for instance, NATO missions, for instance, the key position to control the Black Sea, but also engagement with non-Western partners like BRICS, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and with Russia as well. So Turkey navigates between multiple vectors of influence, increasing its geopolitical influence, shifting from, as we have been as the Vice President said, from a defense importer to a defense exporter, and therefore enabling new forms of diplomacy, like the so-called drone diplomacy, building strong relations with singular important countries for Turkey, like Qatar, for instance, or Ukraine, fostering new alliances in Africa, enhancing its reputation as a major player in global defense market after the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. So to conclude, in this regard, the role of Turkey's geostrategical position and growing defense industry is a potential asset for meeting European needs. For Turkey, moving to sustainable autonomy will require not just building hardware, but also finance, supply chains, technological infrastructure, diplomacy, and how Turkey manages that will have great implications for European security, for Middle East stability, and the evolving architecture of defense cooperation.
Ambassador, thank you very much for that. Murat Yeşiltaş, I want to turn back to you. In your opening speech, you were mentioning Russia's war on Ukraine, but since then, some of our speakers have actually brought up some other areas. Ambassador Peter Millet was mentioning Syria. Obviously, he talked about Libya at the very beginning. Ambassador Marceli talked about Nagorno-Karabakh. How do you feel Turkey's indigenous defense industry and development of that has affected regional military balances?
I think it is too early to say that the regional military balance is changing or dramatically changing. After the 12 days war, yes, there are changes in terms of the military balances, but rather than, framing the region in terms of the military balance with reference to the change, I would rather to frame as what we learned, as a lesson learned from the regional conflict. I think this is the main driving factors that we are going to see how the regional balance of power based on the military calculation will change. How the countries are now learning from the conflict. How the European countries now learning from the war in Ukraine to transfer their military, industrial, technological base. This is the reason why Europe now is recalculating their own defense and security architecture based on different requirements, like drones. There is a lack of drone capacity across Europe. There is no single country that can easily provide any European country to fill their drone vacuum. Turkey is the only country that can easily transfer its own technological capacity. There is also a strategic necessity in terms of electronic warfare. I mean, many European countries, there are a lot of lessons learned in military domains. So how we are going to see the strategic ramifications of this SAFE program or rearm program across Europe? How Germany, for example, will look like after 10 years of spending 1 billion euros its own military? How the other countries will transform their military capacity across Europe after 10 years, 15 years? Then we can calculate how the military balance is going to change in the European strategic landscape. I think we have also the same situation in our region, in the Middle East. So now that there is an aggressiveness of Israeli military strikes against every country in the region, that we are talking about that Israel has air superiority. Israel can easily use, 5 or 6 countries' airspace freely. Israel can do whatever it wants. But we know that Israel has also limits. This is the reason why other regional countries, including the Gulf countries, are more investing their defense industry. to make the military balance again. This is the reason why Turkey now is reconsidering its entire defense industrial complex after the 12 days war between Israel and Iran. So, but before this sort of Ukraine war and the 12 days war and after the genocide in Gaza, but Turkey did a great job in terms of changing the geopolitical calculation in different regions. In Libya, for example. Maybe in the initial stage of the Ukraine war, Turkey did also a great job in terms of preventing Russia to take a quick victory over Kiev, because of Turkey has provided TB2 drones, and it's changed the overall strategic military assessment on the ground. And number three maybe can be taken an example, the Second Karabakh War. Turkey did also a great job there. While the Armenian troops have been, preparing for battle fight on the ground by digging the trench for more than 30 years, then suddenly Turkish drone now became to change the course of actions of different actors on the ground. So I mean, it is sort of a revolutionary military tools that it revolutionized the warfare, but at the same time it revolutionized the different actors' position on the ground. Syria, I think, can be given also another example that how Turkey has been changing and transforming the notion of war, the notion of hybrid warfare with its technological capacity. So as a conclusion, we can argue that Turkey's industrial and technological revolution in its defense industry is changing the geopolitical calculations and the potential course of actions any countries in the region. Now, for example, we are talking about KAAN, KIZILELMA, and other revolutionary platforms, strategic platforms. It has a huge signal effect to the regional countries when Turkey get all these platforms, when Turkey get to prepare to use all the strategic platform, and when Turkey doctrinize all the different strategic platform into its military and defense policies.
Okay. Lovely hearing that perspective. Ambassador Özbekov, let me turn to you again. When Professor Yeşiltaş was saying, look, it's still too early to make an assessment on whether the military balances in the region are changing. I understand that. But in light of the recent memorandum with the Eurofighter Typhoon jet, do you feel that perhaps that will ignite other Euro-Atlantic defense synergies?
I think it's hard to generalize. As I was saying earlier, I do think there is a very strong geostrategic incentive for the European partners of the alliance to do more together in the defense industrial space, but also at the geostrategic level themselves. In other words, to engage together in trying to resolve a number of the regional conflicts. Now, the Eurofighter Typhoon project, I think, is extremely important. It's good for Turkey, it's good for the United Kingdom, I think it's good for improving the European defense capabilities. Will there be more that we can do in terms of frigates for the navies? Will there be more that we can do in terms of the Turkish world-leading technology, in terms of drones and so on, transferring that, sharing that with other NATO allies? I don't know. There's plenty of potential for us to do more things, and as I was saying before, I think there is a need. But I think we should keep in the context the background against which these developments are taking place. They are extremely important, partly because we cannot rely so much on others around the world, and partly because we need the capabilities, we need the AI, we need to be in the frontier of new technologies for our defensive needs, and we need to work more effectively together rather than just squabbling amongst each other and competing unnecessarily. with projects where the demand and the scale is too small to be economically significant and sometimes geostrategically significant. But let us keep in mind what Türkiye actually can do in the region. Türkiye, right next door to Russia and Ukraine, as others have been saying. 170 years ago, the British and the French went to war with the Ottoman Empire to stop Crimea becoming Russian and to stop the Black Sea becoming a Russian lake. I still happen to think that it's not in Turkey's strategic interest for the Black Sea to be a Russian lake, but we've got to wait and see where that goes. But precisely because of its proximity, because it is supporting Ukraine in the same way that the rest of us are, but keeping open economic and political links to Russia, because Türkiye is right next door, it gives it an extraordinarily important role. It may be that historians will say that the discussions that took place in Istanbul in May of 2022 were a missed opportunity to stop that conflict. Who knows? I'm afraid it probably wasn't, because the terms that Putin was prepared to accept for stopping his invasion were unacceptable to Ukraine and to a lot of other people. But I mention it simply because this is an indication of the importance of Turkey's geostrategic role and potential role if Türkiye gets involved again when, hopefully before too long, we get to the stage where the military and other pressures and sanctions against Russia are such that Putin decides that he wants to have a serious negotiation rather than a one-sided set of demands which he expects President Zelensky to accept. Then you've got the extraordinarily important role that Türkiye is playing in Syria next door, which links to domestic political issues here and the fact that the PKK have agreed to stop the fight, to stop sending fighters from the Kandil Mountains into southeastern Türkiye after 30 years or so. Direct link between domestic politics and bringing to an end the armed conflict in part of your country, which we have a lot of experience about, I'm sorry to say, from Northern Ireland, which we've been very happy to share, and domestic developments inside Syria. There is Turkey helping to form new defensive capabilities, helping to bring together warring factions inside Syria right next door. There is Türkiye also offering to be part of the solution to Gaza if the famous 21-point program actually becomes a peace plan. It's a long way from being that at the moment for reasons that we all know. But Türkiye will, I think, be part of that solution if we get to that stage. And then you've got the other neighborhood issues. You've got the rather important development, which we haven't talked about, between Azerbaijan and Armenia. President Trump takes the credit for it. Actually, he did make a difference. But this is good news for Turkey's northeastern frontier. It's good news for Armenia. It's good news for Azerbaijan. It's good news even for Russia, because it will open up the opportunities for further trade. There are issues to be resolved with next door Iran. Now, Iran, being a Shia state, has always been a little suspicious of Sunni Türkiye. But nevertheless, you are next door neighbors. There is an open border. There are millions of Iranians who come through Türkiye because they're welcome here. What's going to happen there in the future, we don't know, but Türkiye is undoubtedly an important player in that neighborhood as well. And then there's northern Iraq. We haven't talked about that very much. There are problems going on in the KRG, which we all know about, but to the extent that that can be stabilized, Türkiye will be part of that. The oil pipeline into the KRG through Türkiye down to Ceyhan has been reopened. That's a good sign. That's good for Türkiye, but it's an indication of the diplomacy through strength that Türkiye is able to bring to bear on these regional things. I could go on, but I watch the clock. I'm just making the point that here in Türkiye, you are at the heart of a series of very significantly moving developments with an extraordinarily important role to play in trying to make the world a safer and more prosperous place. And that is the backcloth to the way in which the extraordinary change in Turkey's defense industrial capability is taking place, and why it's even more important, I think, that we all try to work together in that area. And I hope that, to answer your original question, there will be more possibility for Türkiye and its other NATO allies to develop greater industrial capabilities together.
Okay. More possibilities for Türkiye and its NATO allies to develop partnerships. Since we've really expanding our scope, we talked about Armenia, Azerbaijan, we talked about Iran, we talked about the KRG in northern Iraq. Let's actually look a little bit more to the east. The Vice President in his opening, in his keynote address saying, all right, just because we're looking in other directions doesn't mean that we're abandoning our traditional allies. But we are sort of hedging our bets. Ambassador Marceli was talking about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, like that. When you look at it in that perspective, put that into context for us, if you could.
Gosh, that's a big question. We need a whole panel for that one, I think. Yes, I mean, it links together what we were discussing earlier about the defense element having a knock-on effect both politically and economically. And that's where the economic powerhouse, that's where all our products are still coming from China, from Vietnam and so forth. So looking at economic cooperation and then looking ahead, it strikes me that what we've been talking about is responding to conflicts that have already broken out. I think trying to be more strategic and looking at where the conflicts might come in the future includes looking at, further east as well. I think also one of the things we haven't discussed much is development aid, and there in Africa and in parts of South America, parts of the East, huge amounts of money have been spent in the past trying to prevent conflicts from breaking out, providing humanitarian assistance, especially in Africa. And when you look not only at Gaza but at Sudan at the moment, working together for humanitarian purposes. Your Vice President mentioned, and your President mentioned, the humanitarian assistance that you've been offering to Gaza. Because US aid has been abolished, even the UK and many other European countries have reduced the amount of overseas development aid that they were spending. I think development has a huge important role to play in developing countries. It helps to tackle migration, stopping migration before it even starts. I think the world needs to look at how to provide the humanitarian assistance to support the Millennium Development Goals and all those sort of things that we've talked about in the past. So if you like, where we started on defense, it links across to all these other issues. If you're looking at a new world order, humanitarian and development assistance has to be part of it.
Thank you for that. I know that we're trying to stay true to our time, and I do want to thank everybody, but Ambassador Marceli, I want to maybe end with you. There's one thing I forgot to ask you, and that's the recent acquisition of BAYKAR of Piaggio Aerospace. Give me your take on how this shapes. Do you think it can be the cornerstone of a new strategic partnership between these two countries, what it means for Europe in its quest for security in general?
Well, the fourth Italian-Turkish government summit held in Rome at the end of last April confirmed the strong bilateral commitment in defense matter between the two countries. As a matter of fact, the excellent relations between Italy and Turkey have represented a unique case in the European framework since 20 years. We remember exactly 20 years ago, 3rd October 2005, the access negotiations started. I was ambassador of Italy to Ankara at that time, but in spite of the Italian, British and few others strong support, the so-called Friends of Turkey, of the 35 chapters, only 16 have been opened and only one closed. And since several years, no progress at all. So given the European situation, that may be not so terrible for Turkey, but the global geopolitical situation has changed dramatically in the last years. The Western hegemony is increasingly questioned. NATO is facing big actors like BRICS, and inside NATO, neither the American and European positions are always identical, nor the various European countries have identical positions as well. So there is a multipolarity in international order, but it is a chaotic multipolarity. As a time when European Union, I have to say that, lacks a clear strategic direction. Both Turkey and Italy can give a big contribution to the global defense paradigm. Turkey's role in Africa and the Mediterranean, including Libya, creates natural convergences with Italy, while the strong rapport between Italian Prime Minister Meloni and President Trump can serve Turkey's interest in restoring strategic relations with Washington after years of strained diplomacy. We have also appreciated very much the contribution given by Turkey for Gaza, for the signature of the peace agreement in Sharm el-Sheikh. So altogether, our relations can give a good contribution also to reinforce the position of Turkey in Europe, because we need first reinforce the political position of Turkey in Europe, and Turkey and Europe must understand Turkey has become a great military power, and so we have to include her in our strategic vision.
Like you said, I think a rising middle power when it comes to use, or that uses diplomacy and defense industries wisely. You said this multipolarity world is chaotic, and I think all of us would agree that Turkey can do its part in bringing some sort of sanity and building together, cooperating more. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I know it was a very short discussion, but I think we're just over time. And the thing about these things is that there's a domino effect, and I don't want to steal too much time from the next session. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists, Ambassador Carlo Marsili, Professor Murat Yeşiltaş, Ambassador Peter Westmacott, and Ambassador Peter Millet for this lively discussion. Thank you.